I don't want to skip anyone, but I had just picked up this social identity issue, or when he said that as something that perked my ears up, because I believe that that's based on your experiences. I think people have different social identities depending on what kind of upbringing they had, or what how they've been exposed to certain things. For example, I was exposed to gay people when I was younger, so it was a little easier for me to identify what that was. I also was, raised more liberally than, than some of my other friends that have not been raised, with an educated background where, you're a little more liberal about different identities. My mother was a nurse, so, she was fine until she became a Christian, and she became born again. And I think she'd lost a lot of those senses. She's just regaining them now. She's learned how to be a Christian in herself, because she's had to learn that identity. She's had to learn that, she can follow Christ and also love her son, and, love his identity, not just, I love my son because he's my birth. There's something that came on my body, but I love my son because he's gay and he's in a healthy relationship, and, he's doing good for himself, and he's, a success in his own right. And so I think, again, like I think this is the social identity, in a sense, when you talk about the power, that also comes from, again, your life experiences, being in predicaments where you've had to know that if you're outed, that your power, as your identity takes your power down, specifically when you grow up in the hood, and you're educated. I went from going to a private school where it was only 8 people in the class, and it was $70,000 a year, and there was like one black child. That was me. Hello. Maybe a black girl or two, because there's always 2. And so you go from that to, Prospect Heights, one of the most dangerous schools in Brooklyn at that time. There is this the identity is what you're all about. Your status, your the amount of power you wield in a social setting is by your labels. So I think, being comfortable in those labels and being able to separate the difference between, if I'm outed, how many times I've been in a situation where I'm around a bunch of dudes, and it's easier for me to let them know I'm gay. I mean, there was a time where I was totally out at UPS with a bunch of, our guys. They knew what I was about. I said who I was.
Were they pirates, DJ?
Yeah, they felt like pirates, because that's how they think. They're like very, heteros can be very Niconian. They're just like, they don't know anything. Just like, So, I mean, I just want to, the thing that kicked for me was the social identity, and that's why it's also important for visibility. It's a lot of times that's why we get on certain artists and rappers and think, why aren't we being seen? Because that's again, that's a part of the intersection of knowing where we fit, being a part of that gay agenda. I'll keep saying it. That's the gay agenda.
Yeah. What I'm hearing you point out also that I did hear also what Jude was saying is context matters, right? So it's not just about these systems of power and where you might find yourself in the multiple aspects of your identity with regard to that, but the context in which you are in highlights or has an impact on what is highlighted for you. Alfredo, let's hear a little bit from you about that question. And to go back, it's basically like, how do you define intersectionality, and then what does it look like for you? How does that show up for you?
Great, thank you. So first of all, I think we can't talk about intersectionality without mentioning Kimberly Crenshaw, right, who is the scholar and activist who actually coined the term. And I think, when I think about intersectionality from where she comes from, right, her purpose was really to give name to the invisibility that existed for certain members of communities within larger groups, right? So, when we talked about the LGBTQ movement specifically, right, there are members within it that were still and continue to be invisible, right? And so I think for me, that's when I go back to always when I talk about intersectionality is not so much what it is, but what it's for, right? And it's important for me to understand what it's for, because I think as we talk about context, we also talk about what we also need to talk about, how some identities I'm losing the word, but movable, right? So for example, I am a Latinx person, right? I'm an immigrant. Some people say I have an accent, some say I don't. I'm a light-skinned Latinx person, right? There's not strong indigenous traits in my physical aspect. And so even though I can talk about the oppression that I've seen and received as a Latinx person, I cannot talk about what it's like to be an indigenous person, or have experiences that other Latinx people have had. Mm-hmm. Likewise, depending on where I go. So when I go back home to Guatemala, my class status changes, right? Based on the last name I carry, based on my income level, my class status, right? When I come back to the U.S., that changes again. And so it's important to think about identity, particularly in the context of intersectionality, as something that is not stagnant, right? As something that it's not necessarily permanent. The way I think intersectionality has been really crucial for me is, again, understanding that when I think about what it's for, I like to think of it as a tool, as a starting point, right? As an understanding that that there are many pieces that I hold, and some of those I can actually use to break certain systems of oppression, not just that affect me, but that affect others. Right. And I think the beauty of intersectionality is that it can also be used as a tool to bring people together. Right. So, when I go into what I call a gay space, right, which I see as a very cis-normative, masculine, white space, when I go into those spaces, I know that if I go straight into hey, y'all, let's break this ish down and get down to business, they might be a little apprehensive, right? Because even though there may not be a gay agenda, I would argue that a gay white agenda started with gay marriage, and after that, they seem to kind of be happy with that, right? But if I go in and say, hey, okay, so you're queer, I'm queer, let's talk about that first, right? Once we establish that connection, then I can say, well, that I'm also an immigrant, and that also my parents came here and documented, in the 60s, right? And so I think for me, intersectionality, what it's for is, one of the things I use it the most for is as a vehicle to create connections that I can then use to fight larger systems. Which is ultimately which is the ultimate goal for me, right? Is how do we dismantle these systems that have been oppressive to marginalized groups.
I love it. I love this panel of activists that I have gathered. I'm so excited about this, and I really do appreciate you, Alfredo, giving shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw. So for those of you all who are listening who are unfamiliar or are new to this broader term, I kind of jumped right in with the assumption that we're all on the same page. And I want to apologize to the listeners for that. So this term intersectionality really comes out of work that Kimberly Crenshaw did back in the 90s. She's actually an attorney by training. So if you want to look her up, you want to look up the term, I'd also tell you to look up critical race theory. And currently, a lot of her work has been around bringing a highlight and attention to the fact that Black women are also disproportionately negatively treated by police systems and also in educational systems. So she does a lot of work with the African American Policy Forum, and they're doing great work, and they always are having webinars and information. So, get yourself educated, folks.
Can I just add in? Can I just add
sure.
in that the Kimberly is spelled not with an L-Y, but with an L-E. So if people want to Google it, it's Kimberly spelled with an L-E, and there's actually an accent over the E. And Crenshaw spelled the way Crenshaw spelled.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, Ebony, intersectionality, what does that mean? What does it look like for you?
So, intersectionality for me kind of means taking all the things and all of the complexities that I am, how does that show up to kind of help me be my best self? And I appreciate that, I guess, before me said that it's not stagnant. And that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, well, for me, it changes. The intersectionality for me, it looks very different when I show up to work in an organization in the city, as you know, as an employee of the city of Austin. That looks completely different because all the time I'm not able to show up as all of who I am because that just might not be received well. Y'all get what I'm saying? And, so then when I'm with my friends, I can show up all of who I am. And then in that space, that is where I feel my most authentic. So that's where I feel all of the complexity of who I am. But there are times when everything doesn't show up and it's situational and it's contextual. But I feel like when they all get to show up at the same time, that's where I feel like I'm my most authentic. That's why I feel like I'm sort of in the space where I can reach my highest potential. And I do recognize that everybody's not on the same page with that. And there are just some things that we have to do in life to maneuver and to kind of get around, and so that we are able to set things up for ourselves to be prosperous and to be successful. So I do recognize that. And sometimes it is very frustrating that I just can't show up all of me and all of the complexities that I am and all of the different identities that I carry. So I do have a bit of frustration, and I want to know, like, why? Well, why can't you just appreciate this? Why can't, I just be this and not have to be questioned by it, or not have to tell my whole life story behind it, and how I got here, what happened to me, and something must have happened, kind of thing. I do recognize, though, that I don't show up as somebody who you can easily tell what all of my identities are, especially the lesbian piece. Most people, when they see me, definitely in the South, most people, when they see me, they automatically ask me, where's your husband? If you're single, I have a guy I can hook you up with. And I recognize that I might not look like what people expect a lesbian woman to look like. And I also understand that happens with my profession too. And people say, oh, well, you don't look like how I thought a doctor would look, and I recognize that. And sometimes that's frustrating because it just makes me realize just how complex I am on the one hand, but just how, I don't want to use the word ignorant, but not in a bad term, but just ignorant, we are as a people, as a society, to the many ways that we can show up.
So it's a sense of being unseen, right?
Yeah.
So you're not able to, you don't fit the profile, so therefore I can't see you. Yeah. And just for all the listeners, like, Ebony is like super femme. Not only that, she's like very stylish, very fashionable. She's also young looking. So I get all of those pieces. There's still, moments where I get, I think there was even a hashtag sometime last year about this is what a doctor looks like, or black doctors look like this or something. So I get that happens on both fronts. But
what's interesting about that though? Sometimes, and historically speaking, inside of the LGBTQ community, there was a place for someone like Dr. Ebony, and the term was lipstick lesbian.
Yes.
And unfortunately, when the LGBT community started asserting its own, a lot of the modeling came from the heterosexual community. So you had the top, the bottom, the femme, the butch, the lipstick lesbian, and the other term, which I won't use because I find it offensive. So there's a lot of that, I think, that still carries over. However, people who haven't dealt with any of those communities at all still use strict heterosexual modeling. And if you are a gay man, it means you're effeminate. And if you are a gay woman, it means that you are masculine, because they don't understand, I think, a lot of times how all of that plays out individually.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple months ago, I was having this exchange with somebody that I only know through social media. I've never met her in person, and she lives in a smaller town. And she was saying, like, I don't know any gay people in real life. And I was like, I don't believe that. And I was like, I was sitting in my driveway, and I was like, I'm looking across the street. I have two gay neighbors. Another gay neighbor from down the street just walked up to check his mailbox. I just got off the phone with somebody else that I know is like queer. I'm like, I got like queer people all around me. I don't believe that you don't know any. I believe that you don't know any that look like how you think they're supposed to look. And so I want to kind of use this as a segue, and I want to go back to Alfredo, because I appreciated the piece that you were saying about maybe showing up in some LGBTQ spaces, and I think you labeled them as like cisnormative